begins as a small boy fighting air and time. The asthma comes at night like a thief and sits on his chest. The child hears the rattle of his own breathing and learns, much earlier than most, that life does not hand out strength. It must be built. In a brownstone on East 20th Street, in a house that smells of books and leather and ocean salt carried in on his father's coats, he studies insects in jam jars, birds through a little window, onto the roof, muscles through pain with the help of a doting, formidable parent who tells him the sentence he will carry like a creed: "You have the mind, but not the body. Make the body." He sets up a gym in the family home, lifts iron dumbbells until his arms shake, pounds a bag, rows, hikes, wrestles his own lungs into submission. He reads like a person storing fuel: Plutarch and Darwin, Froissart and Prescott, Audubon and the Federalist, feeding a mind that wants the world entire. His father, Theodore Senior, is philanthropy in a waistcoat, a reformer who despises cruelty and idle vanity, and takes his son to the charitable societies and the workshops where the city's other children learn to survive. The boy watches, notes, decides that duty can look like joy if you refuse to notice how heavy it is. Harvard opens to him like a gate, and he runs through it with the awkward, cheerful intensity that will always be his signature. He's not the most brilliant, but he is the most alive. Fencing, boxing, delivering papers to the Natural History Society on birds he has seen and classified with the fervor of an amateur who loves accuracy more than prestige. He courts Alice Hathaway Lee with a gentleness no later caricature will capture, and loves her with the unguardedness of a man who has already met his own limits at midnight and would like to build a day around something tender. He graduates, enters Columbia Law, discovers that the life of precedent without the life of action is a diet too lean for him, and makes his first leap into politics as if it were the logical continuation of field notes and lungs. New York State Assemblyman at 23, top hat and squeaky voice, a cartoon come to life who writes his own captions in dense, competent paragraphs. Then fate throws stones. On a single day in 1884, Valentine's Day, his mother dies in the family house, and in another room, Alice dies after giving birth to their daughter. In his diary, he draws a cross and writes the line that sounds nothing like the brassy man we think we know: "The light has gone out of my life." He retreats west because grief sometimes needs distance measured in horizons, not in hours. In the Badlands of Dakota Territory, he buys cattle, builds a ranch house, rides in weather that peels the unessential from a man, chases thieves with a Winchester and an innate sense that justice administered in winter is more honest than justice delivered at a banquet in spring. The Harvard boy with the glasses turns out to be, inconveniently for his critics, the sort of person who can sleep on the ground for days and wake ready to lead. Nature is not a parable to him, it is a grammar. He studies it with a boy scientist's discipline and a hunter's appetite, writing essays that are part field notebook, part letter to a future in which men like him will try to save what they have learned to love. He returns east with the sense that if grief cannot be escaped, it can be harnessed. He marries Edith Caro, a steady intelligence from his childhood circle whose presence will become the ballast for a ship designed to sail in all weather. He resumes politics as if the Badlands were a sabbatical arranged by God. Civil Service Commissioner under Benjamin Harrison, he treats the spoils system as a moral failure and the merit system as a patriotic necessity, reading examination lists, pestering bureaus, making enemies of men whose cousins have for too long mistaken public offices for family heirlooms. As president of the New York City Board of Police Commissioners, he rises before dawn, slips through fog to inspect precinct houses, fires the crooked, replaces the hopeless, increases pay, enforces honest rules about saloons and Sunday closing that win him both the wrath of bosses and the affection of people who didn't expect fairness to arrive wearing spectacles. Washington calls him back at the exact pace ambition prefers. Assistant Secretary of the Navy under McKinley, he is the one who reads Mahan's sea power arguments not as books to quote, but as timetables to meet. He pushes for readiness politely, then insistently, then with the sort of good-natured persistence that exhausts resistance. When war with Spain comes, he resigns and writes his own next chapter, because he cannot bear to be the kind of man who orders without having once obeyed under fire. San Juan Heights is a thicket and a phrase. The Rough Riders are a volunteer experiment that works because bravery is contagious. The charge made with regulars and volunteers tangled together is not a ballet. It is a scramble through heat and fear, a brief collaboration between discipline and improvisation. Roosevelt's horse stumbles, he climbs, bullets pass, men fall, the hill submits. The newspapers build a myth with ink. The men who were there build a memory in quieter timber. Roosevelt, newly famous, understands that a reputation is a tool to be used for a purpose larger than the name it burnishes. Governor of New York is the next test, the State House as gym, for a man who believes the future will be administrative. He uses the office like a lever. He goes after the utility combines and insurance lobbies, whose habit is to reward state power with private favors. He demands factory inspections, shorter hours here, a safer rule there. He wakes sleeping commissions and tells them they are, in fact, supposed to do things. Boss Platt, who helped make him governor, finds the pupil uncooperative. The solution, as bosses see solutions, is to promote him out of the way. Vice President under McKinley will neutralize the energy. Fate again writes with a hard nib. McKinley is shot. Roosevelt takes the oath at Buffalo in a borrowed house, and the American presidency enters a room it did not know it owned. He is 42, a century young and personally at high tide. He believes, without cynicism or apology, that the federal government is the only instrument large enough to discipline the new colossi. Railroads, trusts, national markets, and the only honest institution that can speak for the public interest when private interests have learned to fill every hallway. He does not improvise a theory. He has been writing it in letters and reports and in the way he has lived. The square deal, a phrase cleared of poetry by his use, is not a program you can fold and file. It is a posture. The law should be even-handed. The strong will not be allowed to turn strength into immunity. The weak will not be patronized, but will be protected from the kind of exploitation that pretends to be natural law. He chooses a cabinet with craftsmen in it, Elihu Root at war to rebuild the army's brain and bones, Philander Knox at justice to test the Sherman Act's antique language against modern combinations, James Garfield and later Oscar Strauss at commerce and labor to create a habit of federal fact-finding, James Wilson at agriculture, quiet, useful, a gardener of national competence. Northern Securities is the first great legal duel, a railroad holding company erected by men whose names are themselves species of capital, Morgan, Hill, Harriman, to rationalize the chaos of competing lines. Roosevelt insists that rationalization becomes tyranny when it eliminates competition by treaty among giants. He directs the Department of Justice to sue, not to expropriate, not to punish profit, but to assert that there is a boundary between integration that lowers prices and combinations that tax the public by private decree. The Supreme Court agrees, narrowly. The precedent is less a thunderclap than a weather change. The federal government is back in the ring with a referee's whistle, and more importantly, the stamina to stay for the whole fight. The anthracite coal strike of 1902 is the moment he invents the modern presidency's temperament. Winter approaches. Miners led by John Mitchell want higher wages and shorter hours. Operators prefer starvation to negotiation. The country, fueled by coal, faces literal cold. Roosevelt does not send troops to break the strike. He does not sermonize from a safer move. He calls both sides to the White House and insists, a new verb in executive practice, on arbitration. He threatens, if talks fail, to seize the mines, not as a Caesar, but as a steward under emergency necessity. The men leave, grumble, return, and agree to a commission that delivers increases and reduced hours without conferring union recognition. No one is entirely pleased. Everyone continues to live. The public learns a useful lesson. The president can be custodian of the common interest without becoming a tyrant, provided he is careful with force and prodigal with patience. He extends federal reach into the ordinary life of food and medicine, because muckraking has revealed that laissez-faire markets can sell filth and call it flavor. The Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act are not exercises in moral outrage. They are the line where commerce acknowledges that trust is as much a part of a nation's wealth as steel and wheat. He does not write the statutes with his own hand. He does write the political melody that makes them easy to pass and difficult to repeal. He strengthens the Interstate Commerce Commission with the Elkins and Hepburn Acts, turning a once embarrassed regulator into an agency with authority to set rates and examine ledgers, moving railroads from private kingdoms into public service guided by law. And always, as if breathing were not possible unless trees were being saved, there is conservation. He is not a sentimentalist. He has hunted and will hunt again. He has slaughtered bison and wept over birds. He understands that the difference between use and waste is a discipline, not a feeling. With Gifford Pinchot at his side, he creates the United States Forest Service and converts millions of acres into reserves that are not museums but schools of sustainable practice. He signs the Antiquities Act and creates national monuments with a pen that becomes a wand: Devil's Tower, Montezuma Castle. Grand Canyon first protected as a monument when mining lobbies still thought of it as an inconvenient hole. He expands the national park and refuge systems, withdraws coal lands from private raid, orders surveys, plants the first bureaucratic trees that will become the vast sheltering woods of policy. He camps with John Muir in Yosemite and listens to a prophet of preservation argue for sacredness. He later sides with Pinchot when Hetch Hetchy becomes a test of what it means to love a valley, a municipal reservoir to save a growing city, or a cathedral to be left unentered. His choice offends the purist. He thinks the point of keeping America beautiful is to keep Americans alive under conditions that permit generations to be born, and to work without stripping their grandchildren of breath. Abroad, he prefers firmness without hysteria, and he plays, often, the long game. He supports a canal across Panama not as an imperial ornament, but as a commercial and naval necessity in a world that demands speed. Colombia hesitates. Panamanian independence arrives, helped by American ships in a way that allows everyone to lie to themselves just enough to sleep. And the United States signs a treaty that gives it a strip through which it will carve a new geography. He supervises engineers as if they were building his own house. He replaces the yellow fever of French failure with the screened windows and drainage ditches of American sanitary science. He asks Congress for money, not as a wish, but as a bill of materials and a schedule. He sends the Great White Fleet around the world in 1907, not to threaten, but to demonstrate a capacity that is a deterrent when politely displayed. He writes to the Kaiser and to George and to ministers you have forgotten. Warns and cajoles and jokes his way through a dangerous decade, and most of all, mediates peace between Russia and Japan at Portsmouth, proving that an American president can be an honest broker and that he himself can perform humility without becoming small. The Nobel Committee, astonished to find vigor wedded to restraint, gives him a prize. He is pleased in the boyish way men are pleased when a medal recognizes an idea they have been trying to teach all their lives. At home, he has the instincts of a Democrat who believes completely in hierarchy. He invites Booker T. Washington to dinner at the White House because he considers the man's talents and accomplishments sufficient reason for fellowship at a table. The South explodes in racist fury. He is startled by the vehemence, chastened by the politics, and never retreats from the fact that he did the decent thing, though he learns to do it less theatrically. The Brownsville affair wounds him. Black soldiers are accused of a violent night raid. He orders the dishonorable discharge of an entire battalion when courts cannot find the shooters and suspects a conspiracy of silence. Years later, evidence will exonerate men he wronged. It is the worst of him and the time, a love of discipline that became injustice when discipline met race and fear. He is capable of rethinking, but not of public contrition. He is very modern and very 19th century at exactly the same time. He reads the muckrakers, scolds them for loving filth too much, and also uses the facts they bring to strengthen the hands of reformers. He coins phrases that stick because they are less witty than they are accurate. The bully pulpit is not a boast, but a recognition that the presidency's megaphone, used conservatively, can focus a moral argument so tightly that statutes are a natural next sentence. He speaks to children as if they are citizens, and to citizens as if they are children who might, on the best days, deserve the truth. He preaches the strenuous life because he has lived the fragile one and knows that muscles are forged under load. He cultivates journalists who tell him what is true rather than what is flattering, and he punishes, with exclusion rather than law, those who treat gossip as public service. He chooses not to run in 1908 because he believes the Republic should not be a man's mirror. He chooses William Howard Taft as successor because Taft's mind is judicious and his heart decent, and because Roosevelt thinks the program, regulation, conservation, clean government, an executive that believes in work, will continue under gentler hands. He leads with relief and manic energy. Sails to Africa with Kermit for a safari that is half science, half exorcism, collecting specimens for the Smithsonian with a rifle and a taxonomist's notebook. Then tours Europe the way a boy might tour a museum, meeting sovereigns, lecturing, collecting honors like postcards. He returns to a country noisier than when he left, and to a party that has, in his view, misread the meaning of its own achievements. Taft has prosecuted trusts, strengthened the ICC, signed tariff reform that is more mutter than shout, and alienated progressives by embracing old guard men as if they were harmless uncles. Roosevelt re-enters politics with the zeal of a man who hates to see a project half-finished and defines half-finished as everything not yet done. His new nationalism speech in Osawatomie is both a diagnosis and a confession. The modern state must be strong enough to regulate industrial power in the public interest. Property is sacred until it injures the community. Social insurance is not charity, but prudence. The executive must be an instrument of continuous moral adjustment. He does not propose to seize fortunes or gut markets. He proposes to civilize them. The Republican Convention of 1912 becomes a cage he refuses to inhabit. Denied the nomination by party machinery that loves Taft's calm newer than Roosevelt's fire. He bolts and constructs a third party whose nickname, Bull Moose, comes from his own cheerful description of his health. He is shot in Milwaukee by a confused man with a grievance. The folded manuscript of his speech in his pocket slows the bullet. He bleeds through his shirt and speaks for almost an hour anyway, the impossible spectacle of a mortal creature proving, with a ridiculous demonstration, that will can trounce fear. He loses the election because a split party cannot defeat Woodrow Wilson's discipline, and because the country admires courage and then, typically, chooses caution. He does not retire gently. He writes op-eds and books at a pace that would exhaust a newsroom and a university combined, assessing the new administration's tariffs and banking reforms with a mix of grudging respect and irritated superiority. He supports preparedness as Europe slides into catastrophe, suspects, correctly, that neutrality is a mood, not a policy, and tries to convince the country that waiting too long to be ready is the same as choosing to be weak. He sends his sons into war. Quentin is shot down over France. The grief is bottomless and transforms his public letters into private elegies barely disguised as arguments. He goes to Brazil and explores the river of doubt with Cândido Rondon, nearly dying of fever and infection. The expedition, a perfect machine built out of hubris and curiosity that somehow does not break. He returns diminished in the body and magnified in the myth. The explorer who wanted to see a line on a map turned into a river he could touch and nearly paid the ultimate price for proving what ink could not. He dies in his sleep at Sagamore Hill in 1919. The house he built into a world. The world he built into a house. Flags are lowered. Enemies sigh in strange relief. Friends do not believe the earth can be as loud without him. What remains is the architecture of a presidency remade without a constitutional amendment, by practice and personality, rather than by clause. An executive who speaks for the public with data and moral clarity. A federal state that gathers facts and puts them to work. A conservation ethic that treats the continent as a trust for the unborn. A foreign policy that understands power as a vocabulary with multiple verb tenses. a domestic policy that refuses to let bigness be an alibi for badness. What also remains are the limits and errors of his time and his temper. On race, he is better than many, but insufficient to a crisis that would require saints. On civil liberties, he loves order so much that dissent sometimes looks like disorder to him, when it is merely unpleasant. On empire, he trusts American tutelage too readily, because he assumes that the best people will be in charge and that the best people will stay that way. But to read him only as contradiction is to miss the coherence of a life that insisted on channeling energy into service. He was a boy who learned to fight for breath, and a man who made a career out of insisting that the country should never have to fight for the basics of decency. He loved birds and battleships, lectures and long rides, laws and stories. He could be vain, overbearing, and wrong. He could also be generous past the point of calculation, candid to a fault, and right when it mattered. He made enemies because he refused to draw his circle small enough to make friends the only goal. He made a modern nation out of a federation that had been trying, after the war, to remember what it was for. Imagine him, for a last scene, late at night in the White House, the family asleep, the corridors, a geography he now knows better than any battlefield. On the desk, a draft order to withdraw another 1,000,000 acres of forest from hasty lease. A letter to John Hay, editing a clause in the next circular note about China. Commas placed like little fences that protect meaning from mischief. A memorandum from the ICC with a chart of rates that will lower freight by pennies and increase justice by a pound. A map of Panama with a red pencil line where a cut must be made. A pamphlet from a novelist he respects, underlined in 3 places where sentiment had muddled truth. A telegram from San Francisco about a school board segregation order and a Japanese minister's wounded pride. A note from Edith reminding him to be kind to a senator whom he finds tedious. He sharpens the pencil, writes in the margins, makes 3 decisions, and postpones one. He leans back and thinks, as he often does, of his father's injunction to make the body and the mind fit together. He thinks of a bird he saw at Rottreek that afternoon. He thinks of minors and infants, sailors and stenographers, students and shopkeepers, and how the presidency feels at its best, like keeping faith with all of them at once. He understood better than most that power collects in new places faster than constitutions revise themselves. So he learned to translate old clauses into usable tools, and to surround each translation with institutions strong enough to endure different hands. After the anthracite settlement, he pushed the country toward an ethic of investigation before accusation. The modestly named Bureau of Corporations, tucked into his new Department of Commerce and Labor, became a pair of eyes that could see through the paper walls of holding companies and pools, assemble facts about capitalization, rebates, and interlocking directorates, and hand the Attorney General something more useful than outrage. The Elkins Act in 1903 went at railroad rebates with the precision of a bookkeeper. Carriers that favored one shipper with secret concessions would face federal penalties. The Hepburn Act in 1906 widened the Interstate Commerce Commission's jurisdiction, and more importantly, let it set maximum rates and examine ledgers. He did not think law alone could domesticate bigness. He fought steady law, sustained by inquiry and carried by an executive willing to be disliked, could make bigness serve the public without crushing enterprise. The idea that a modern republic could have both efficiency and fairness, that it could enjoy abundance without bowing to private governments, required a permanent posture rather than a single performance. He supplied the posture day after day and taught the public to expect it. When he moved from rails to pantries, he kept the same rhythm: scandal, inspection, statute, enforcement. Upton Sinclair's novel supplied the heat. His investigators supplied the light. The Meat Inspection Act and Pure Food and Drug Act supplied the architecture that would, over a century, keep confidence flowing along grocery aisles where trust is invisible until it disappears. He did not pretend that a label was a sermon. He insisted that a label be true. He valued the small decencies that add up to a civil civilization. milk that will not sicken a child, patent medicines that cannot be laced with lies, and he understood that a market is a moral achievement sustained by shared expectations, not merely by price. He could talk about rail rates in the same hour he talked about borax and sausage, because he believed both were part of the same project, to make industrial modernity compatible with Republican self-respect. Conservation, which in him felt as natural as breath, grew from private joy into public system. He had lived under Western skies and learned what dryness means when it is not a symbol but a condition. He had walked among redwoods and felt how smallness can be turned into gratitude instead of greed. He had watched rivers spend themselves stupidly in floods and dust. With Gifford Pinchot, he built a national forestry program that treated forests as working cathedrals, replanted, protected from fires set by carelessness and bad incentives, inventoried with the fussy pride of men who know the difference between a ledger and a guess. He read reports about grazing and said that grasslands should be used without being murdered. He read reports about reclamation and said the West must be watered by intelligence, not luck. The Newlands Reclamation Act of 1902 was not poetry. It was a revolving fund that took receipts from land sales and poured them into dams, canals, and ditches that remade acres into farms and towns into economies. He withdrew coal lands from speculative plunder, reserved power sites for future public needs, and used the Antiquities Act like an emergency brake for beauty, proclaiming national monuments with a speed and frequency that infuriated the men who considered scenery an uncashed check. He could be ruthless with a pen, but it was a ruthlessness in defense of a future he meant to leave to children he would never meet. If some decisions, like Hetch Hetchy, cut conservation against preservation, it was because he insisted that love of nature be expressed in a grammar large enough to conjugate both reverence and use. The White House he ran was kinetic without being chaotic. He breakfasted early, read dispatches with a pencil, summoned secretaries with the impatience of a man who genuinely believed the country preferred action to apology, and then, when the day's formal obligations ended, poured his excess into family and friends with the same gusto. He boxed until his eye was damaged. He wrestled. He walked with a speed designed to separate dilettantes from comrades. He led point-to-point hikes across Rock Creek Park, sending cabinet officers and diplomats up and over fences not as hazing, but as a lesson in the virtues of uncomplaining exertion. The house itself became a kind of school. Children charged through it like cavalry, sometimes with ponies, hunting imaginary bears down corridors where earlier administrations had preferred whispers. Edith Roosevelt ran the place like a combination of salon and sturdy nursery, elevating the tone without letting ceremony strangle appetite. Reporters learned that this president had time for them if they had time for facts. He invented the press room and the press availability, not because he liked seeing his name in print, he did, but because he believed the executive's best ally in a fight with entrenched interests was an informed public that could be persuaded to see a pattern where entrenched interests preferred fog. His sentences behaved like machines that had been built to do work. Short when they needed to be, large when they must carry freight, unafraid of adjectives but more in love with verbs. He spoke to the country as if it were a bright student that needed challenge more than praise. He distrusted cynicism because it was so often cowardice smoked in irony. He ridiculed the cheap radicalism that finds villains so quickly that it forgets to find solutions. He kept close at hand the gospel of strenuous life, not as a postcard to a younger self, but as a public medicine. He had little patience for the fatalism that called itself philosophy and the laziness that called itself contentment. He could sound like a preacher and act like a coach. He could sniff out the difference between genuine opposition and mere obstruction, and treated the first with argument and the second with attrition. Race and democracy exposed his limits and his reach. When he invited Booker T. Washington to dine at the White House, he acted as if decency were contagious, and he expected the country to behave as maturely as his table did. The national reaction exposed how far the culture had to travel, and how lonely an executive could be when he decided to move ahead of a habit that likes to call itself tradition. The Brownsville dismissals, ordered on the theory that discipline must encompass a whole unit when silence shields guilt, were a moral wound he did not stitch publicly, later evidence restored the honor of men who had been stripped of it. He was capable of changing his mind, but his temperament did not lend itself to confessional performances. He pressed for fairness in federal appointments where he could. He denounced lynching with presidential volume. He backed some measures that would have strengthened national supervision of elections. He lived, nevertheless, within a system that he did not blow up and a party coalition he could not command into courage. Judging him precisely requires holding two truths at once. He was, for his time, better than most men with power on the question of black citizenship. He was not as good as the principle he claimed to serve. Immigration tested him in narrower corridors in which local schools and global diplomacy collided. When the San Francisco School Board tried to segregate Japanese students, he confronted a municipal prejudice with national consequence and brokered a solution: desegregation in the city, a gentleman's agreement with Tokyo to regulate passports, that turned a racial insult into a diplomatic compromise. It was imperfect, and it avoided the fight he could not win. It also preserved parity in the Pacific at a delicate moment without surrendering the country's soul to demagogues. He recognized, in the same breath, that the United States could absorb multitudes without dissolving, and that the art of absorption required policing the boundary between equality under law and the preservation of a civic culture that knows what it is. He did not always define that culture with the precision immigrants deserved. He did more, often, than nativists would allow. Abroad, he practiced restraint with a cavalry officer's readiness to move. The Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine recast a familiar sentence into the pragmatic grammar of the 20th century. Chronic wrongdoing or impotence in the Western Hemisphere might require intervention by a civilized nation, and in the interest of hemispheric order, the United States would, reluctantly, act as an international police power. He did not relish the phrase. He used it as an antiseptic. In the Dominican Customs receivership, he tested the model. Rather than suffer European gunboats seizing tariffs at the custom house, the United States took over the receipts to stabilize finances and pay debts, avoiding a pretext for colonization while establishing a precedent that smelled like tutelage and stability at once. It was empire's shadow without its conquest. And it taught the world to expect a United States capable of using fiscal instruments where earlier empires would have used marines. He hated chaos in ledger books because chaos in ledgers quickly becomes chaos in lives. He also liked order because it was the precondition for liberty in places where liberty could be confused with anarchy. In Asia, his instinct for balance was most delicate. The open-door notes were moral instruments disguised as trade policy. No power should carve China into closed provinces of privilege. Tariffs and railways should remain open. Integrity of territory should be a principle, not a phrase. He had no divisions to enforce this generous geometry. He had credibility among powers that disliked each other but recognized steadiness when they saw it. He favored Japan's modernization, but not Japan's hunger. He esteemed Russian culture, but distrusted the Tsar's politics. He understood that a steady Pacific required that no single power bully the doorway to markets and to dignity. The fleet that circled the globe in peacetime was less a threat than a postcard. We are capable of reaching you and also of returning home without panic. If foreign affairs taught him the uses of grace, army reform taught him the uses of structure. With Root, he installed a general staff, professionalized the service schools, arranged an orderly rotation between line and staff work, and modernized the legal and medical arms that had been treated as conveniences rather than as determinants of victory and virtue. He paid attention to coastal defenses without worshiping them, insisted that promotion not be the reward of mere chronology, and considered morale not a mystery, but a managerial obligation. He loved swords and speeches about courage. He loved even more the paperwork that keeps courage from being wasted. He also changed the presidency, not by winning a war or seizing an emergency, but by building routines and demonstrating how communication could be a governing act. He treated annual messages as blueprints rather than as lists of hopes, wrote special messages when he needed the country to see the hinge on which events were turning, and performed leadership in the open air while keeping the machinery of compromise humming indoors. Photographs of him exist because he wanted citizens to feel that government was happening in their own time, not in a painting over a fireplace. He loved to be seen. He loved even more to be understood. That is why he explained the most complex issues in analogies citizens could hold in their hands. A trust was a knife. A rate schedule was a river. A forest was a bank account. A canal was a pair of shears. A treaty was a handshake that needed witnesses. The decision not to run in 1908 expressed both confidence and a misunderstanding. He had faith that the program, now normalized, could survive without his nervous system. He underestimated how much of reform is momentum protected by personality. Taft's preference for process over pressure, his genuine devotion to law unadorned by theater, and his ease with conservative power brokers created an atmosphere in which the old ways sprouted again. The Payne-Aldrich tariff betrayed the promise of real revision. The Ballinger-Pinchot quarrel exposed fissures in the conservation camp and gave reactionaries pretext. The prosecution of U.S. Steel for a merger Roosevelt believed he had sanctioned in the 1907 panic felt to him like ingratitude masquerading as purity. He did not detect betrayal so much as misreading, and the remedy he chose was more energy. His new nationalism speech crystallized what he had been inching toward for a decade. The nation is prior to any private interest. Property exists under a social contract. The judiciary should not be the last word when it disables self-government. Social insurance for injury, sickness, and old age is a conservative hedge against radicalism. A living wage is a moral minimum. Women and children need the law's special protection because markets are indifferent to the weak. Direct primaries, the initiative and referendum, and yes, even mechanisms to check judicial decrees might be necessary where oligarchy had disguised itself as procedure. He did not think these proposals were radical. He thought they were hygiene in an industrial republic. The Progressive Party in 1912 was a liturgy of hope. Its platform read like a list of repairs a serious mechanic would make to a machine he intended to drive. For the next 100 years, the convention, with Jane Addams nominating him, felt like a moral revival. The campaign, with his bullet-holed shirt displayed after that Milwaukee night, felt like theater angered by fate. He lost in a three-way split that produced, instead, a professor-president who would enact large portions of the progressive program while insisting that he had invented it. Roosevelt bore the defeat with vigor and commentary, the latter sometimes generous and sometimes volcanic. The Europe that drew him grudging respect for Wilson's tariff and banking reforms pushed him into attack when neutrality became a policy sustained by adjectives instead of defenses sustained by rifles. He argued for preparedness as a civic duty, not as a party label. He argued for calling enemies by their right names because he had learned as a boy choking for breath that euphemism does not open airways. When war came and his sons went, his pride lived with his grief. Quinton's death cut him where laughter had once bubbled up. The public letters looked like policy, but read like mourning. The Brazilian expedition revealed the part of him that had never been appeased by offices. He longed for the test. The River of Doubt, later the Rio Roosevelt, showed how much testing a body can endure once a will has decided to endure it. Illness staggered him. Infection almost folded him in two. He considered letting the river take him to save others the burden of carrying him out. He found once more in the middle of pain an argument for life. He returned altered, 30 pounds lighter, white with fatigue, internal damage that physicians could soothe but not undo. The boy who had once heaved iron to subdue asthma now felt the old enemy return in new forms. He kept writing, kept speaking, kept imagining what America should do after the war to keep its soul intact while exercising power in a world that would mistrust it for being both rich and right some of the time. He died before he could watch the country try. The ledger he left is practical and untidy, like the country. He used antitrust power against combinations that insulted competition and promised to use forbearance where scale humbled price without strangling entry. He lost some suits and won others. He turned the state into a fact-gathering organism that later reformers could command. He reduced the freight of monopoly not through purity but through persistence. He taught business that regulation could be a shield against chaos if industry consented to transparency and decent margins. He showed labor that the executive could be more than a nightstick and less than an accomplice. He proved in the coal crisis that the whole nation could be the client of a president's patience. He protected watersheds and slopes and animals and ancient dwellings and horizons because he believed democracy required common possessions that train the eye and the character. He built schools out of reservations, laboratories out of bureaus, and habits out of slogans. He wove the executive mansion into a public workshop without turning it into a stage show. He wrote enough prose to staff a small newspaper for a decade and read enough books to shame mild scholars. Judging him harshly is easy because he left edges. He believed in order so much that he sometimes mistrusted those parts of liberty that sound like mess. He believed in expertise so much that he sometimes undervalued the stubborn wisdom of communities that resist reformers with fine credentials. He believed in nationalism so much that he sometimes strapped too much to the word American and made room too narrow for the many ways citizens choose to live. On race, he rose above his class and time in gestures and some appointments, and he fell beneath justice when fear of disorder met his creed of discipline. On empire, he preferred hygiene to conquest, and sometimes called hygienic what others would call domination. On courts, he loved equity, but flirted with mechanisms that would have broken the delicate link between law and popular will if deployed by lighter men. He was not a saint. He did not pretend to be one. He preferred being useful to being exemplary. The deeper assessment must account for continuity. What we call the progressive era is in part the institutionalization of his temperament. Government as an active umpire, information as the precondition to arbitration. Conservation as policy rather than as postcard. Labor peace pursued by structure rather than by sermons. Domestic commerce protected from its own worst appetites without being smothered. The presidency as a speaking office that educates and a working office that coordinates. He did not accomplish this by seizing powers the Constitution did not grant. He accomplished it by using powers the Constitution had long provided and that timid or indifferent men had failed to exercise. He added to the national vocabulary sentences that later executives could use without citation. He made it easier for successors to trust their own voices without trusting their own egos. He built a state that could carry the burdens of the 20th century without teaching citizens to kneel before it. Picture him once more, not as the portrait on a moose button or the caricature with teeth, but as a tired man at Sagamore Hill tapping a letter about forestry to a Western congressman who wants to trade trees for votes. He tells a story in the middle of the letter about a pronghorn he saw at dawn, and then returns to the paragraph where the appropriation lives. He scribbles a note to a schoolboy who has written to ask about books, recommends Homer and Audubon and a brisk walk. He answers a mother whose son wants to join the Marines with a line about courage and prudence. He drafts a column explaining why America must honor alliances it makes with itself. Workers protected from maiming, children protected from mills, the landscape protected from extraction that forgets to count tomorrow. He puts down the pen, rises, and steps outside to the porch, where the bay wind empties his mind of the residue of argument. The house is full of voices. The family a nation in miniature, the lawn scuffed by play. He looks, briefly, like a man who has just been reminded that the point of politics is not politics, but the texture of lives lived without dread. If we ask what endures, Set aside the monuments and count the habits. The federal habit of knocking on corporate doors with questions backed by statute endures. The public habit of expecting government to referee without owning the game endures. The continental habit of setting aside wonders and waters for the unborn endures. The executive habit of walking into deadlocks and insisting on arbitration endures. The civic habit of talking about citizenship as a strenuous practice, paying attention, telling the truth, taking responsibility, endures wherever the republic is still worth the effort. His shadow falls across both parties. In the century that followed, each borrowed something. One, the confidence that markets need supervision to remain free. The other, the confidence that national purpose can harness energy without disappearing the individual. Even those who dislike his conclusions work inside the rooms he framed. He is also a caution. Charisma can be virtuous when it lifts courage. It can be dangerous when it tempts institutions to depend on mood. He left behind organizations robust enough to survive duller men. He also left behind admirers inclined to believe vigor is its own justification. The lesson is not to mute the executive. It is to remember why he used volume, only to make hard facts audible, only to give the country the courage to do the next necessary thing. He would ask us, if he were permitted a last piece of pedagogy, to prefer the difficult usefulness of governing to the easy narcotic of performance. The generation that buried him loved him not merely because he entertained them, but because, beneath the entertainment, he had given them a country slightly more adult than the one he inherited. They had cleaner food, a more honest post office, fairer rail rates, a rifle that fired straighter, a map with a canal that shortened voyages, the treasury that knew what its gold was for, forests and gullies and masses with signs that said, "For you and your children," and a vocabulary that let them ask more of their leaders than adoration. They also had the ache of unresolved things, segregation's grip, labor's vulnerability, where the law ran out, the contradiction of tutelage abroad, wrongs that would require other hands and other seasons. He would not have sulked. He would have demanded work. He always did. When the diaries are shut and the biographies stacked, his meaning for a serious age comes to this. He modeled a way of being a citizen with power. He read hard before he spoke. He spoke plainly before he ordered. He ordered reluctantly before he used force, and he never used force to hide the absence of thought. He married appetite to duty. He raised children and trees and statutes. He did not confuse optimism with prediction. He used optimism as a tool to bend outcomes toward decency. He laughed easily and admitted defeat rarely, but accepted it when it came. He was wrong in ways that hurt and right in ways that lasted. He lived as if the Republic were a daily practice of muscle and mind. He asked the country to do the same, and for a time, it did.
Midnight rails under silver moon, dusty boots on a winding road. A shadow's the only friend I've known since she packed up and let me go. Empty whiskey bottle on the seat, her laugh still echoes in my bones. Saddle's heavy with memories. I ride alone where the wind still blows. Nowhere else to be. 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 sunrise paints the horizon gold, but it don't warm a lonesome soul. Every town I pass feels half her size. Every trail's haunted by goodbye. I whisper prayers to open skies, hoping someday my heart'll find a brand new path beyond the pain where broken hearts can heal in time. Nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be. Nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be. Nowhere else to be. Nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be.